Hello and welcome to Saturday's edition of Alaska Weather on the 5th of November 2022. Up first, pretty strong winds developed as forecasted there across southern Alaska, Kodiak Island and the northern Panhandle. Valdez, peak wind gusts so far of 66 miles per hour. Eldred Rock there in Lynn Canal, 61 miles per hour. Palmer and Kodiak, peak wind gusts so far 60 miles per hour. And Seward and Sitkinak Island there is up to 56 miles per hour. And moving on, we've got, due to those high winds, high wind warnings are out and until 7 p.m. Saturday for the Matanuska Valley. Expect winds of 40 to 55 miles an hour with gusts to 75 miles per hour. And also high wind warning out until 7 p.m. Saturday for the Thompson Pass to Valdez area there for winds gusting as high as 80 miles per hour. And also now high wind warning out for downtown Juneau. South winds 30 to 40 miles an hour with gusts up to 70 miles per hour. And of course, damaging winds could possibly blow down trees and power lines. And that's for the Juneau area for tonight until Sunday, tomorrow. And also out in the Bering Sea with St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait coast, as well as the northwest coast into Kotzebue, the Noatak Valley, and the western Arctic coast. Those areas shaded in red, signifying a winter storm warning for all of those areas for tonight through Sunday, and in some cases Sunday night, especially for the western Arctic coast. It'll last a little longer there and improve to the southwest throughout the latter part of Sunday and Sunday night. But that's for blizzard conditions, looking for possibly 6 to 10 inches of snow with winds gusting 50 to 70 miles per hour. Of course, that'll create visibilities down to less than a quarter mile at times in the blowing snow. And satellite imagery showing big frontal boundary out there over the northwest Bering Sea back to the western Aleutians. Good southerly flow, warmer temperatures pushing northward there. The Cirrus Shield now onto the southwest coast and well north of St. Lawrence Island, actually into the Bering Strait and the Chukchi Sea this afternoon with thickening and lowering clouds as you head southwest and southward. Otherwise, pretty good conditions there for the central Aleutians with some clearing. Also for the Fox Islands, Alaska Peninsula, a lot of clearing over south central Alaska with those strong winds, strong outflow winds increasing. And now all the shower activity pretty much south of the Panhandle now, down toward Dixon Entrance. Still some lingering clouds over the southern southeast coast, but definitely clearing out and the drier, colder winds coming in from the north and northeast there. And also Copper River Basin, pretty windy this afternoon. Winds 25, gusts 45 miles an hour out of the north with the stronger wind gusts in the channeled areas of Prince William Sound. As I mentioned, Valdez, 66 miles per hour. And Copper River Delta, probably even higher gusts than that with that tightening gradient. And you can see the front there, kind of a couple of waves rolling up that frontal boundary there, kind of nudging it eastward a little bit. And warm front just about to St. Lawrence Island this afternoon with some snow and blowing snow spreading into the area. Winds out of the southeast there, but high pressure entrenched over the Alaska Peninsula and building and slowly strengthening over the north central interior areas, and that tightening the gradient up along and south of the Alaska Range into the North Gulf Coast areas, and that's supporting those strong surface winds we had also into the northern Panhandle today. And for tonight, that high edges over the Yukon, actually pretty close to Dawson there, and pressures build to 1,053 millibars. And as that moves eastward, that's going to allow the system to slowly push northeastward and make some northeastward progress there with the snow and blowing snow into the Noatak Valley, possibly the Selawik Valley. But that cuts off rather quickly. Look for winds to dramatically decrease over Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay area, and start to come down after midnight through Cook Inlet area as well as the Kenai Peninsula, with a tightening gradient occurring over the eastern North Gulf Coast and Panhandle there. Again, possible wind gusts to 80 miles per hour there in the northern southeast coast out of the northeast, and then a system south of the Aleutians brings gale force winds, rain, another round of warmer temperatures into the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilofs tomorrow. The original front weakens, but spreads snow and blowing snow across the northwest coast, Noatak Valley to the central Arctic coast. And winds really come down across south central Alaska and the North Gulf Coast tomorrow afternoon, but stays windy there over the entire southeast coast, dry and cold. And that continues into Monday, dry, cold weather, but winds coming down even over the Panhandle. Warm push of air and moisture into south central and the western interior, and increasing clouds on the east side. For tonight, lows, single numbers and teens for the Panhandle, and anywhere from 15 below to 10 above for south central Alaska. Highs tomorrow in the 20s and 30s, colder over the inland areas. Lows down to 20 below in the Copper River Basin Monday morning, 30 for Kodiak. Highs warmer, Bristol Bay into the upper 30s, mid to upper 20s, south central Alaska, and in the 20s for the Panhandle. Up to the northeast tonight, lows 15 to 25 below, followed by highs 5 above to 5 below, but much milder the Seward Peninsula there in the 30s, followed by lows below zero in the east and in the 20s to the west. Highs, single numbers in the east, mid-30s out west. For the southwest coast, lows tonight in the 20s to lower 30s, and mid to upper 30s for the Aleutians. Highs tomorrow, 40 to 45, except mid-40s along the southwest coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather, a lot of VFR over the interior from the Arctic coast right on down into Bristol Bay, Unalaska Island eastward, across the entire North Gulf Coast and Panhandle. All VFR for Sunday morning. Out toward the west coast, though, some areas of marginal VFR showing up with IFR into the Bering Strait and the west-southwest Seward Peninsula, and that extends southwestward there and covers areas of the Aleutians from Nikolsky to Shimianatu. IFR there in the Pribilofs extends up to Nunivak Island. And for the afternoon, we'll see the VFR holds over much of mainland Alaska, out to the southwest coast now and into at least eastern Norton Sound. And Kodiak Island, IFR, though, advancing to the Alaska Peninsula from the eastern Aleutians. Another batch out there over the western Aleutians. Then they both kind of merge there over the central Bering Sea, covering the Pribilof Islands, and the zone extending north there across St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait and now onto the northwest coast, Kivalina, Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, and some marginal VFR to the central Arctic coast. Otherwise, no change over the interior Panhandle areas. And for Monday morning, may see some IFR show up due to low clouds fog over the Yukon Flats. Otherwise, no change over interior Alaska, including the Panhandle southward to Prince William Sound. Marginal VFR along the central western Arctic coast as far east as maybe Prudhoe Bay. Otherwise, IFR a little more extensive now out to the west and southwest. St. Lawrence Island along the southwest coast, making inland progress a little bit there, but pushing across Bristol Bay to southwest Kodiak Island. Marginal VFR up to about Fogneck Island, Kamishak Bay, Iliamna areas. And for the afternoon, that pushes northeastward. Marginal VFR now covering Cook Inlet and Turnagain Arm, all of the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound there, and the North Gulf Coast. Staying VFR, Yakutat down across the Panhandle, and areas over the eastern interior and back to the northwest, all the Arctic coast VFR. IFR there from the northwest coast across southwest and western interior, and also the central eastern Aleutians, mostly IFR. And for the passes, Anatuvik and Atigan, all the passes VFR for the day for the Brooks Range Sunday. Alaska Range, same thing, good VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill, ceilings visibility is unlimited for rainy and windy. Isabel, wide open. VFR flying either approach. Mintastan now VFR on either entrance. Tanita, good VFR the entire day. And same thing for Portage. Clear skies. And Chilcoot and White, VFR, although those passes probably pretty darn bumpy and turbulent. And for the freezing levels, 2,000 feet, they're right up north of St. Lawrence Island, almost to the Bering Strait, and 2,000 feet just south of St. Lawrence Island, and 6,000 to 8,000 feet there over the southeast Bering Sea. And for icing, with the moisture pushing northeastward there, mostly over the western Aleutians, could be some isolated moderate rime icing along that batch there northward to St. Lawrence Island, pushing into the northwest interior and to the central Arctic coastal areas. And for the jet stream, southwest flow, westerly actually, 110 knots plus there into the western Arctic coast, and then northerly flow shifting eastward across south central Alaska tonight, and then eastward tomorrow into the eastern North Gulf Coast. You can see 115 knot northerlies there coming right down across Yakutat, and then the warmer air of that southerly flow out over the Aleutians and the Bering Sea up to 105 knots there just southwest of Nikolsky and Unimak Island. And looking at 9,000 feet, good southwest flow there out over the Bering Sea, 60 to 75 knots there, turning north over the ridge axis up to 50 knots along the western Alaska Range, Kamishak Bay area, 55 knots on the Alaska Peninsula, northeast at about 35 there over the southeast interior areas. Pretty light for the Panhandle though, as well as under the high pressure area up over the northern interior. And at 3,000 feet, 40 to 60 knot winds over the northern Panhandle out of the northeast, the strongest on the north coast to about Yakutat, and then strong winds into the Alaska Peninsula at 85 knots ahead of that next low center there, putting a squeeze on the atmosphere between that low center and the high farther to the east, and that results in moderate chop.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. Big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There are probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding their terminus point. But the Kenai Fjords, the Tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is nothing, is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, you know, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
You know, when you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change the glacier systems, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, you know, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths. It'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. When you walk down one of our trails that leads to Exit Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. And there's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell, as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes, which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle, and we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to the marine forecasts. There along the south coast, gale warnings, northeast winds 40 to 45 knots. Storm warnings for the north coast with northeast winds 50, gusting 65 knots. Lynn Canal, pretty windy tomorrow. Sustained northerly winds at 40 knots, gusts 55 knots. And for Stevens Passage, northeast 30 with higher gusts, northwest 25 for Clarence Strait. And then for the day on Monday, still pretty windy, but slowly diminishing winds across the area there. For the north coast, out of the northeast, 30 to 40 knots. And gale warnings continue on the south coast for northeast winds 35 knots. Stevens Passage, gale warnings north at 35, northerly winds at 40 knots for Lynn Canal. And Clarence Strait, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots. Prince William Sound, small craft advisory Sunday, north winds 25 knots, seas down to 4 feet. And gale warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 35 knots with higher gusts out of the Copper River Delta. And gale warnings for the Barren Islands, north winds 35 knots, north 25 for Kamishak Bay, and for Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. For Monday, Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, winds now east at 25 knots, seas 4 feet. And southeast 30 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands and western North Gulf Coast for southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And Kamishak Bay, southeast winds at 45 knots with seas 17 feet. Gale warnings for southern Cook Inlet, east winds increasing to 35 knots, seas building to 10 feet. And for Kodiak Island tomorrow, north winds 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, east-southeast winds at 45 knots. And Bristol Bay, east winds increasing to 30 knots, seas building to 6 feet. And for Monday, Alaska Peninsula, winds southwest 30 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, south winds 40 knots, seas around 10 feet. Gale warnings for Kodiak Island, east to south winds 35 to 45 knots, with seas as high as 22 feet. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, storm warnings, east-southeast winds 45 to 55 knots. Central Aleutians, gale warnings, northeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And the western Aleutians, east-northeast winds at 20 knots. And for the day Monday, western Aleutians, gale warnings, west winds 30 to 35 knots. West-southwest winds at 30 knots. Central Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the southwest coast, South of Nunivak Island, looking at gale warning Sunday, southeast winds coming up to 35 knots. Pribilof Island, southeast winds increasing to 40 knots, seas building to 14 feet. And for St. Matthew Island, southeast winds at 30 knots. Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, south winds 30 knots, seas 12 feet. And for Monday, Norton Sound, southeast winds 30 knots, but east 35 knot winds for St. Lawrence Island. On the southwest coast, gale warnings, southwest winds 40 knots, seas 15 feet. Pribilof Island, southwest at 25, west winds at 30 there for the St. Matthew Island area. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, brisk wind advisories for southeast winds 15 to 25 knots. Small craft advisories for the central coast, southeast at 30. Full gales for the western Arctic coast, south winds 45 knots from Cape Beaufort to Cape Thompson. Storm warnings south at 60 knots. And then for the Chukchi Sea, south winds 40 knots. And gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea on Monday, east winds 35 knots, western Arctic coast, east winds 20 to 25 knots. South winds at 15 for the central coast, and lighter winds on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Monday, south to southeast at 10 knots. And for tonight, again, winter storm warning St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, as well as the northwest coast, Noatak Valley, and the western Arctic coast for winds of 50 to 70 miles per hour. Those winter storm warnings out through tomorrow, start tonight and continue through tomorrow. And also a high wind warning out for the Juneau area for strong winds to 65, possibly higher gusts there. And high wind warning tonight for Valdez and the Matanuska Valley. And then for tomorrow, system moves up, gale force winds and rain, warmer temperatures into the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilofs, warming also over the northern Bering Sea with diminishing winds and snow tapering off, but snow and blowing snow for the northwest interior and the western Arctic coast, slowly spreading eastward. Winds lightening up, south central Alaska, but still cold and dry, and windy, cold and dry for the Panhandle. And for Monday, stays dry and cold for the southeast coast with slowly diminishing winds.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.